So this talk, Entheographical Explorations, was a lecture I gave at the Entheogenesis Australis Conference on Sunday, 10th of December 2017. And they did film the lecture, and I had 35 minutes to go into a lot of material. And at this point, haven't put up the YouTube talk and video of the lecture, and I'm not holding my breath. I have given lectures at other conferences and they just never show up. So I decided to take matters into my own hands and record this slideshow on my own computer and go more into depth on this topic, which is my exploration of 5-MeO DMT containing plants, not bufo alvarius toads. And many people in this time are looking to smoke the bufo alvarius extract, which contains 5-MeO DMT. And I've smoked it myself, and I was not interested. At lower doses, you feel like you're becoming a toad. Although the higher doses with the bufo toad extract and the synthetic will essentially take you to the same place that people believe to be the penultimate psychedelic experience, the elusive +4 experience. And I should say, I'm not necessarily enamored by the +4 experience. I am looking for a low dose 5-MeO DMT experience. I always gain the most value from smoking, say, 5 milligrams of synthetic 5-MeO DMT. And the large doses I found really intense and often confronting, and at the end of the day, once you've experienced that a few times, may not be really that valuable after you've done it a fair few times. I ended up doing this research on the most viable plant sources of 5-MeO DMT because I inherited some money from my Aunt Julia, who was Obi-Wan Kenobi's travel agent, among others. And initially I thought that I was going to be researching indigenous psychoactive plants that were not well researched or understood by the global community. However, I quickly understood that many of these indigenous traditions and understandings and cultures had been eroded, and what was left was very much tied into secrecy and initiation. So I realized it was going to take a very long time to do this research and more money than I had. So I thought, okay, what else can I research that needs to be researched that I think can contribute and enable a greater understanding of these plants? So it was a no-brainer for me because the 5-MeO DMT containing plants were not well researched. We didn't know how they worked on people, which ones were good, and I didn't know anyone extracting 5-MeO DMT from plants, excluding maybe the Phalaris species. And so this is a list of some of the plants. This is part of the short list that I worked from, and you can see here there's Iodia leptococoa, formerly melicope. So 0.2% total alkaloids means that in 1 kilogram of plant matter there would be 2 grams of alkaloids, of which 0.07 will be 700 milligrams of 5-MeO DMT. I looked into this one briefly, it grows in New Caledonia, but compared to the other plants in New Caledonia, it's only known to grow in a few spots, so I didn't want to commit time to this one. So in the Fabaceae family, the Desmodium genus, very interesting. I have to admit that the Desmodium gangeticum, I didn't notice that one initially. This number 0.575 meo DMT, you really need to dig a bit into the literature to find that number. So this one has particularly become more interesting to me recently because of my research into the other desmodiums, especially Phyllodeum porcellum. These other desmodiums, some of them contain DMT and 5-MeO in trace amounts, and other interesting beta-carbolines and alkaloids like hordenine. So these species here, nothing particularly interesting trace amounts, but this one here really caught my eye. The Phyllodeum porcellum containing 0.2% 5-MeO DMT, and normally the 5-MeO DMT in most of the plants is not 0.2%, it's 0.02% or 0.04% DMT, something like that. So this is an extraordinarily large amount of 5-MeO DMT, so of course I was very interested in exploring this plant. So the other plants I was looking at is the Varrola plants, the Varrola trees, and especially the Sebifera, Theodora, and Elongata, and I'll go into that later. Especially this tree from Brazil interested me very much because its bark contains 0.004% 5-MeO DMT, which is quite high. And this one also, Dutalia drupaceae, interested me as well. Actually, when I went to New Caledonia, I found the name had changed to Comptomella drupaceae, and this one here interested me as well. This one here is used in Chinese medicine, and it contains very little 5-MeO, this one too. Another plant that's relevant here is Pilocarpus organensis, which is said to contain 0.41% 5-MeO DMT. And I believe I discovered the Pilocarpus in Brazil, and I'll go into that later in this presentation, but I generally believe that the Pilocarpus, even though it looks promising for many reasons, it's not a really good candidate for further exploration and deep work. So I really began my adventure with these plants when I was in Darwin, and I wanted to see if I could find the Phyllodeum porcellum around Darwin, because there were some GPS coordinates around Darwin. And you can see here that the Phyllodeum porcellum branches into two species, the variant porcellum and the variant globreus. Now I believe that Australian researchers may be confused to believe that the variant porcellum actually grows in Australia. I found no evidence that it does grow in Australia. Only what I believe is the variant globreus, and I can't be sure of this identification either. But you can see that they really don't look very similar at all. So I'm not sure of the alkaloid content of the variant globreus, and I didn't test what I believe to be it, though you know, if you look at it a bit closely, it may well not be the right species. And you can see here there's some GPS coordinates from the Atlas of Living Australia, where you can see there's some records of collections of the Phyllodeum porcellum and the Phyllodeum porcellum variant porcellum and the Phyllodeum porcellum variant globreus. However, it appears to me the only variety that does grow in Australia is the Phyllodeum porcellum variant globreus. You can see here this is a distribution of the Phyllodeum porcellum all through Asia, and also growing up around here in the Northern Territory and in far north Queensland. So I went to a few of these GPS coordinates, and I believed I found something very similar. But you can see here they're very different plants. I don't know why they're classified as being variants of the same species. They're completely different. And the GPS coordinates in Australia, there's only a few. It's not a well-known plant. It's not endangered, but there's not that many GPS coordinates, and there's not many of them growing. I went to some GPS coordinates in far north Queensland, and I found nothing. I came up with nothing at all. I wasn't able to find anything that even slightly looked like it. So I can safely say to Australian researchers that you're best heading further north, perhaps into Papua New Guinea, because Australia appears to be only a place where variant globreus grows, and I doubt that it contains the same alkaloid profile. My first destination happened to be New Caledonia, and I had visited New Caledonia many years before, and I had found Dutaliu drupacii, and through the GPS coordinates had discovered one specimen and managed to find some seeds. And unfortunately, I wasn't able to bring back plant matter or make a tea or bring them back for analysis, but I did bring back seeds which were never propagated. I sent them to a friend who didn't quite understand the value of them. And you can see here it said that the leaves yield a quite pure 5-MeO, and it has some other interesting chemicals in there. So this analysis was carried out because New Caledonia has a lot of interesting plants, and they were looking for some sort of cancer cure. So it was published that they found 5-MeO DMT in various plants in New Caledonia, including this one here, Dutalia aureophilia, which is much less common, and also has all these other alkaloids in there. So in my first visit to New Caledonia, I was never able to find this, and realized it was much rarer and so much less interesting as well. So I sort of decided to focus more on this one. And finally, I got a chance to visit New Caledonia. As you can see here, there are not that many GPS coordinates for Comptonella drupacii, so it's not massively common in New Caledonia, but it does exist there and does grow there to some degree. And going back, I was fairly confident that I was going to find it again, and then I realized how similar all the plants are in New Caledonia, or remembered how similar they all are. So this is not Comptonella drupacii, and neither is this, and this is it. This is what it looks like. And I actually don't know what this black stuff is here, but you can see the sort of this black stuff was a feature of the area in which I found them. There's another picture. So having found the Comptonella drupaceae, then came the process, okay, how do I test it? I made an extract using acetone, and I basically soaked 100 grams of the leaves in acetone, and I snorted it, and it was active. It was definitely containing 5-MeO-DMT. However, when I was doing the research, I came across this interesting article about 5-MeO-DMT and Jonathan Ott's experiments with nasal, sublingual, and oral preparations of 5-MeO-DMT, where he talks about using as little as 30 milligrams of 5-MeO-DMT orally, and concluding that it was roughly 1/3 the potency of intranasal, sublingual, or pharmawasca routes. So I was inspired by this and decided to make a tea from the Comptonella drupaceae, and these are my notes here. So me and a friend took 50 mils containing about 37 grams of leaves, cooked once for 5 hours with citric acid. Ott said that the effect of oral 5-MeO-DMT begins at 30 milligrams. It was maybe more active than you would expect 15 milligrams of oral 5-MeO-DMT to feel. Very healing, spacious, connective, good feelings, etc. I would expect 100 mils of the same 30 milligrams of 5-MeO to be much more potent. 200 mils, about 150 grams, to represent some breakthrough states similar to 10 to 15 milligrams of synthetic smoke 5-MeO, but for an hour, with another hour coming down. It would seem to me the amount of alkaloids is thereabouts 0.05%, and the original testing put it at 0.04% pure 5-MeO. You can also clearly taste the 5-MeO in the leaves. That would mean 1 kilo of dried leaves and twigs would contain about 500 milligrams of pure 5-MeO. Initial forays into the light doses already mentioned gives feelings of light and clarity, deliver a much higher integrated healing state than the synthetic material, as I originally thought. Therefore, I believe natural 5-MeO from plants like this represents the best way by far to take 5-MeO. Taking light doses of bufo, for example, are not that pleasant or effective. I feel like a toad. I believe these more light medium doses hold an absolutely huge potential for people. There are other plants with natural 5-MeO, but this one is a clear standout for me so far. Well, at this point, this was really the only plant that I had really tested. So for me, it was a bit of a revelation that the 5-MeO was orally active, and me and a friend tested it and found the effects extraordinary and healing and profoundly beneficial. I never got a chance to try the really high doses of this tea, though I would be interested in pushing the dose and taking a much higher dose and seeing what would happen. So my journey led me to Brazil to look at the tree Dictyoloma incanescens, which was the first tree or plant to ever be tested to contain 5-MeO-DMT. And you can see here some pictures of the tree at the top, and you can see various GPS coordinates, and most of these GPS coordinates are in Brazil, around here. This is all Brazil, with more coordinates around South America. So it was to Brazil that I was headed. So this is a picture of a little tree here, and yeah, I ended up driving around many hundreds of kilometers, if not thousands of kilometers, around Brazil on roads like this in the most beautiful countryside, trying to find specimens of this tree. And this is a photo I took before I was really sure of the ID, and this is pretty sure this is the tree here. The other plant that I was keen to find in Brazil was the Pilocarpus organensis. And you can see here that Pilocarpus contains 1.06% alkaloids, at least in one test, of which 5-methoxy DMT was a major constituent, 0.41%. So that's an awful lot of 5-MeO DMT, and is actually inconsistent with most of the other plants. So of course I had to check it out. A couple of friends of mine said, well, be very careful of the organensis because of the pilocarpine, which is a dangerous compound, and no one knows where the pilocarpine is in the pilocarpus. So, looking at this, I was, of course, concerned about this, the rest of the alkaloids, because it's not a pure source of 5-MeO DMT. And you can see here the GPS coordinates are quite localized in a specific area of Brazil. And also interesting to note, the Pilocarpus name, actually the official name, these Latin names change all the time based on various botanists and their mood swings. So you can have as many as half a dozen names for some of these species, but apparently now it's Pilocarpus pauciflorus. So not too many GPS coordinates. I went to a few before I actually found the plant. And when I found it, it seemed pretty clear to me that I'd found the right one. Though, it's a tricky thing to do to ID plants. And I took a little bit of root bark and I tasted it. And trunk bark. I took the trunk bark and tasted it, and I certainly tasted the alkaloids, but it didn't feel friendly to me. And considering in this GPS coordinate, I just found one specimen, it certainly didn't appear to me a very prevalent plant. So again, that's not very interesting if it's not particularly prevalent in nature, if it's very localized in the area and it's difficult to find. For any kind of continual usage, you're going to have to grow it yourself, which is, could take many years. So this was not particularly promising, and also the amount of plant matter you can attain from this plant. There's not too many leaves on it, not too much bark. So even though the amount of 5-MeO DMT is said to be very high, it's probably not very fruitful in order to obtain the 5-MeO. And the other issue with this plant at this time was the other alkaloids, of course, which we don't really know what they are, and could contain pilocarpine. And especially at this point, I was more interested in the tea, taking a tea from the plant. And just tasting this plant, which I believe is the Pilocarpus organensis. It didn't taste too friendly. Didn't particularly inspire me. So I basically crossed that one off my list. Considering that the Dictyoloma incanescens is much more prevalent, there's much more plant matter, comes off as a much more friendly tree, I decided, well, that's most likely a more promising source of 5-methoxy DMT, even though it's much lower. Though again, it's one of these things you never really know. There's so many mistakes that people make. It could have been a freak alkaloid test where they got a very high concentration of 5-MeO-DMT. Maybe you know, the plant next door has 10 times less, or it's wildly variable. So there's so many variables in this field that you simply cannot say too much based upon one alkaloidal test, which is actually what you're basing your research on all of the time. So after being in Brazil, I moved on to Colombia and thought to myself I was interested in researching the various Varroa species. And there's many different Varroa species, but only a few of them really have a good amount of 5-MeO-DMT, and some of them even have NN-DMT, as you can see here. And of course, this is a very short summation, and especially Varroa elongata here. Whole bark yielded 0.23% 5-MeO. So that's pretty consistent. Very interesting how nature seems to give these consistent amounts of chemicals here. Interestingly, there's some reports that the Varroas contain 1,2,3,4 tetrahydroharmone and these other beta-carbolines. It could be very interesting to research these trees. This is actually from Snoo's book, Garden of Eden, where he talks about the issue or conundrum of 5-MeO-DMT being orally active at all, and Snoo expresses some cynicism perhaps that it could actually be a viable source or a viable experience for experiencing 5-MeO-DMT. And here he states that perhaps it's the lignans of Varroa elongata that could actually affect and produce the oral activity. And also, we did find that the Comptomella drupacii taken sublingually was actually very potent. I personally couldn't take it. It was very, very strong in the mouth, but when I was in Brazil, I gave it to a man who actually did take it sublingually. He found the effects very powerful. So obviously, taking 5-MeO-DMT sublingually is more powerful, but traditionally, Varroa is taken orally as well. So that's something that is not well researched, and in my understanding of Varroa, I realized that very little research had been done on Varroa, only really the initial exploration. So you can see here the distribution of Varroa theodora, which is well known to contain quite large amounts of 5-MeO-DMT, and it occurs all through Amazonia, but especially this area here, which is in Colombia, and areas of Colombia that are actually largely held by the guerrillas. And my friends in Colombia told me, don't go there, someone will put a gun to your head and shoot you because you're a gringo, and it's just not safe. So I did what I could. So, but here you go. This is actually Varroa elongata. There's more specimens of it here. Many more occurrences, but probably not as a viable source. But actually identifying and differentiating between the different species of Varroa, when I looked at the leaves, as you can see at the top, they're basically in the canopy of the rainforest. How do you even begin to identify the differences between these trees? I did spend some time, especially in this area, which is sort of the border of the Amazon. It's sort of, you can see the mountains here, and then this is around the Putumayo area near Florencia, and there's some GPS coordinates that I actually went to this area where very few gringos go, if any. I didn't see any gringos in this whole area. And I went to a few of these GPS coordinates and was simply not able to identify anything that I could perceive that was Varroa. And like I said, almost impossible to ID. Though some friends of mine actually did find that the people harvesting, the loggers who were harvesting the trees, did manage to find specimens of Varroa. And that might be the best way to obtain the bark. However, I don't believe the loggers actually really know how to ID the differences between the many different species. So fast forward a few months, and I was invited to Mexico to smoke the toad and take mushrooms with James Jesso and Kalindi, both strong allies of mine in the psychedelic scene. On this day, Kalindi and I climbed the mountain and we smoked the toad. My experience of smoking the toad was perhaps underestimating the experiential toxicity. I had smoked the toad before, but just in low dose amounts, just enough to taste it, and my experience was that I felt like a toad, and I didn't feel like reaching back into the higher dose experiences. So when I smoked the toad this time, I really felt that I had been poisoned, that it felt very toxic to me, and it took me some time to surrender from the stun, that pure sense of being poisoned and stunned. And I perhaps think some people might feel that they're dying, that they can surrender. I'm used to 5-MeO-DMT and synthetic 5-MeO-DMT and allowing that surrender to experience. But in this case, I felt some warning signals go off. Eventually, I was able to surrender into the experience and had a bit of a spaz out, to say the least. But I did come to that purity in the experience where I felt that I really felt, wow, this is what the pure natural 5-MeO-DMT experience is like. It felt very healing and beneficial in the body. I had a feeling that I'd not experienced with the synthetic DMT, the 5-MeO-DMT ever. Of course, a lot of people will say, well, the synthetic 5-MeO-DMT and the natural 5-MeO-DMT is the same because our scientific instruments say there must be. I, having a lot of experience with synthetic compounds and natural compounds, say, at least to me, experientially, synthetic compounds and natural compounds are a world apart, and the natural compounds are much smoother, and I find them much more constructive. The synthetic 5-MeO-DMT I have found harsh and grating upon my system. So a lot of this research was inspired because I no longer wanted to pursue smoking or taking synthetic 5-MeO-DMT in any manner. So the next plant in my list, and actually the last plant that I was seriously interested in, that I had hopes would provide a tea that would be orally active. And this plant, Desmodium purpullum, is especially interested because of its high amounts of 5-MeO-DMT. You can see here, this is an extract from Trout's notes, that it has a very high amount of not just 5-MeO-DMT but NN-DMT, very interesting, but also bufotenine, and even more interestingly, these kooky MAO inhibitors, these beta-carbolines, which I have looked these up on Google, and there's no research that's been done on these beta-carbolines. So immediately, of course, I thought, wow, this is going to be the one I reckon is orally active. And I pretty much knew when I came across this, wait on, this is a plant with NN-DMT, 5-MeO-DMT, bufotenine, and 6 beta-carbolines. It must be orally active, but also it grows in Asia. I immediately twigged, okay, I've been looking for a tea that works, that is orally active based on my experience with the plant from New Caledonia, the Comptomela drupaceae. This plant grows in Asia. So it basically dawned on me, wait on, this plant is Soma. This plant is Soma. What else could Soma be? What better plant would you expect to find? What other alkaloids would you expect to find? I mean, the only way you could probably beat this, if nature could do a better job, is if it contained mescaline as well. I mean, nature hasn't left much out of this that's extremely interesting. Or maybe it contains psilocybin as well. But this struck me as extraordinary. You can see here, again, 1.1 alkaloids, a lot of these, the bufotenine again, the 5-MeO-DMT, these beta-carbolines. So it's found throughout India, Ceylon, and Malaya. It's used through all these different cultures, and has traditional folk medicinal usage, interestingly enough. So my thoughts at this time were, well, okay, this is it. This plant has the highest content of 5-MeO-DMT of any of the plants that I've researched thus far. It goes far beyond the 0.02% even up to 0.2%, which is just 10 times the amount. So it's very significant amount of 5-MeO DMT. And I didn't really find any research on this plant anywhere on the internet. Some people on the DMT Nexus had claimed to have found some plants, or some people in Australia had grown some seeds, but I didn't find any people reporting taking this plant, which actually didn't surprise me because I understood what it actually takes to go out in the field and find these plants. It's not an insignificant quest. It's not easy. As you can see here, this is a short list of some of the scientific studies that's being carried out on the Phyllodeum pucellum. Especially many of these studies show some effect on the liver of mice, and especially it shows all kinds of effects, especially related to inflammation and reduction of blood glucose, for example, liver collagen protein. And there's many other studies that it has been done on Phyllodeum pucellum, simply because it's very active and it has many interesting alkaloids, and it has a folk medicinal use all through Asia. So it makes sense that it actually works, that it does do what it says on the packet. So here's a distribution of where it grows. You can see up the top here, that's some dried samples. And GBIF is a good resource, but you can see there's not that many GPS coordinates in India, and I've learnt, look, just because the GPS coordinates are not there, it doesn't mean that it actually doesn't grow there. And I've also learnt, just because the GPS coordinates are there, it doesn't mean that it does grow there either. So I ended up in Taiwan, and you can see lots of GPS coordinates. I thought, okay, look at all those GPS coordinates. There's going to be heaps of it growing there. And I was wrong. I probably visited most of these GPS coordinates within reason. Even these ones here. And couldn't find it. Couldn't find anything even close to it. And what I would find in Taiwan was an extraordinary array of biodiversity. I was walking around in the forest and saw so many different plants. It's almost as if I didn't see the same plant twice. So yeah, that was a good 2 weeks of wandering around looking for this plant, and had to admit defeat and move on. But I found some lovely Acacia confusa trees here, and my friend, I had a friend test the phyllodes of the Acacia confusa trees that I collected right at this spot, and he found that it contained 0.5% DMT. So yeah, you don't necessarily need to extract from the bark. The phyllodes of, or the leaves of any acacia tree is going to be very active. Yeah, so these are obviously beautiful trees, and a good sustainable way to harvest from them is to take their phyllodes and leaves, and that goes for all acacia species. So I left Taiwan, moved on, and travelled in South Africa and Iran, and then ended up in Thailand, where I thought I might find Phyllodeum porcellum. And this is a website I found in Thai showing some GPS coordinates. You can see here there's a map of Thailand, and I ended up in this region here, obviously, because there's the most GPS coordinates around here. And when I arrived in Konkan, I thought that I would get out of the airport, and in the taxi I would see bushes of the Phyllodeum everywhere. How wrong I was. It took me some time to find it. I basically I drove on my scooter pretty much half a day, didn't see anything like it. But this was the first specimen I found in a national park, and in just a single standalone specimen. And of course, it's beautiful plant. So happy to find it. You can see why they call it showy desmodium. It has this area here. This is where the seeds are, though it wasn't seeding. The little flowers in there by the time I met this one. But not a real big plant. And interestingly enough, after I found it, I walked all around the whole area. I didn't find another one, so I just found one specimen in the near a walking track in a national park in the hills, and I immediately thought, "Whoa, this is a beautiful area." So I got off my scooter, and I walked around the forest, and that's when I found this specimen. So I realized quite quickly that, okay, these plants, they don't like to grow just anywhere. They like to have some beauty around them. They need some pristine land. They probably don't like growing near fields with lots of chemicals. They demand a certain purity in where they grow. And this is when I really hit gold. I got off my scooter and walked into the woods, and I found lots of them, growing quite prolifically. And of course, I was quite happy at this point. There's a little close-up of you can see the little flowers in there. And you see they've got this interesting effect when they kind of they're green here, and then they go white, and almost got a reddish color to them, though perhaps that photo doesn't show it quite so well. So initially I pulled out the plant whole, but considering what I've learned about them since, that they take a long time to grow. This specimen might have taken 2-3 years to grow. That it's probably best to prune them, to take prune a little bit like this, a little stalk, and let the whole plant grow. Might seem obvious, but at the time I was also interested in testing the root bark, which I basically found to not that interesting. I found the leaves to be the interesting part of the plant. I did manage to extract the alkaloids out of the root bark, but just sort of, they came out of it as a kind of crystalline mush. And I didn't get that much either, so I wasn't that inspired to pursue the extraction, because simply the tea works so well. And on this day, I managed to cook up some amount, 200 grams fresh, my stir-fry hot plate, and experience something quite interesting. Definitely the feeling that I'm experiencing a medicinal effect. Not quite nauseous, but I felt a great deal of clarity and uh, a basic healing effect. And at one point, I go into an automatic deep breathing, a kind of pranayama. And when I experience this, I know for sure it is soma. I have rediscovered soma. So there wasn't any doubt in my mind at that point, just with a small amount, not that much as a tea. I was experiencing a medicinal psychoactive effect, and I could experience the clarity of the 5-MeO DMT. Of course, 5-MeO DMT is not visual, so you're not experiencing so much visual experience. You experience an internal somatic dialogue. You are experiencing greater connectivity and awareness in yourself. So it took me some time to take it again. I took it again the next week, and it didn't do anything. I did pretty much the same amount. I didn't feel to drink more because it tasted so strong. But again, I felt that medicinal presence. And then the week after that, I took it again. And interestingly, it takes me a week each time to go into it because, frankly, it's a little bit intimidating. It's quite an intense experience, and what the resulting after effects in my life, I'm experiencing a slow process of making friends with this plant, and pretty much I'm taking thereabouts the same amount again for the third time, 50 grams fresh. And the first effect that I have is that I feel it in my liver clearing heat, which is what it's used for in Chinese medicine. And I feel an extraordinarily medicinal effect. A lot of detail, like I can feel or even like a robot, a hyper clear liquid robot in my liver, healing my liver from within, opening up channels. And I've experienced a lot of psychoactive plant medicine. I've never felt that level of clarity in how it's working on me and opening up these channels. So the nausea is very strong, very, very strong. I don't actually get nauseous with ayahuasca or equivalent plants these days. So they say with soma that even Indra gets nauseous and vomits with soma. So I'm not quite Indra, but considering that I don't get nauseous very often, it is very interesting that I did experience a lot of nausea and I did throw up. So the experience, the visual experience, I was not anticipating. Of course, I knew it contained DMT. That would give a visual experience. I wasn't at this point quite cognizant and aware that at this dose that perhaps it might give a visual psychoactive experience. So I was quite shocked by what I experienced, and I experienced a lot of beauty. The experience was quite pure. I seemed to be entering into the domain of the plant, its internal landscape. It was inviting me into its world, and that world was very pure. I was very much welcomed into that world, and at the end of it, I went back through the tunnel that I went into, and the arms waved to me. They were saying goodbye. And so, yeah, it wasn't shocking. It was something very calm and relaxed and pure that I had experienced. There was no sense of um, there was no sense in myself that, okay, I've really discovered something here, because I already knew that I had. I already knew that this plant was really something. And this experience only confirmed that I'd really discovered or rediscovered something very, very interesting and perhaps helpful for a lot of people. And the next few hours, I experienced some communication with the plants that appeared kind of cartoonish and maybe even trivial to some extent to the human mind. But yeah, I was in a reverie and a deep, relaxed place, and I felt gladdened and content to be in that place. Very similar to a sort of a boga afterglow. If I can describe the experience like compared to any plant, I would describe it something similar to ayahuasca crossed with a boga, but probably a bit more like a boga. That strong interface with the plant spirit. So this was me cooking it up, and you can see here that it's a golden color. You can literally see that it's golden. Of course, the leaves here are green, and this is very striking that it's this golden rusty color, which is exactly how Soma is described in the Vedas. And the more I do research on Soma and the Phylodium, the more I'm convinced that the Phylodium is Soma. Whether it is or it isn't, maybe no one can say for sure, really. It doesn't really matter to me because the Phylodium is a discovery that is significant onto itself, and what's most significant is what we can actually do with it and how it can actually help people. So there is another plant that's quite interesting that contains a high amount of 5-MeO-DMT. It's called Desmodium gangeticum, and it also contains DMT and also contains an obscure beta-carboline here too. But very interestingly, it is known and called Somya and Om Samat in the Vedic and Ayurvedic ancient traditions, which directly translates to rich in soma juice. If that's not a dead giveaway, I don't know what is. So this is actually an extract from a book written by a man called Ananda called The Soma Conspiracy. And he talks of there being 5-MeO-DMT and beta-carboline alkaloids in plants like Desmodium gangeticum and also Desmodium pulchellum. And I have met Ananda, and if these plants were growing in Norway, I bet he'd be all over it. But I'm quite sure he's never used these plants. Why Phylodium pulchellum is by far the best candidate for the Vedic Soma. Only one known plant in Asia can give a visionary experience in one plant containing both beta-carbolines and tryptamines, both 5-MeO-DMT and N,N-dimethyltryptamine, the power and the glory. In fact, both Comptonella drupacea and Phyllodeum purcellum are the only plants I know of whereby you can drink a tea from the plant and have a potent experience. It is an oral 5-MeO-tryptamine state whereby the individual can realize unity with the divine, which are all the hallmarks of the revelations within the Vedas. Soma is described as golden yellow in the Vedas and as a green, golden, brown or red-hued liquid which was expressed from the plant material after crushing the plant with stones, not pressing out the juice as people commonly think. It is described as a stalk or sprig, and the drink having a very rich and sweet taste. I found the drink very inoffensive, nothing like ayahuasca or cactus juice, nothing quite so bitter or offensive, much more friendly and sweet. The nausea and vomiting is quite pronounced. Even Indra vomits when drinking soma. There is a hymn that suggests that the drink not only prompted ethical behavior, but that ethical behavior was to begin with, was necessary to derive the full benefit of soma. This is a very short summary of a much bigger investigation, and I am working on maybe a talk, maybe an article, maybe a book along the lines of why Phyllodeum purcellum is the best candidate for the Vedic soma. My belief is that soma is a plant that can help many people to heal, clear their channels in their body, and to have a deeper revelation of a spiritual experience. So in many respects, it's nothing new. It's not something that is radically different to, say, ayahuasca. The active chemical constituents are the same, beta carbolines and tryptamine. So my experience with it is like, oh, this is something very familiar. This is something very known. I know this. It's nothing really that fresh, that new. But also it is new, and I think it does have value. I think it has a unique perspective. I think that this plant could help create new culture, could assist humanity in many ways that we don't yet understand. I don't believe that humanity should be going back into the past and trying to recreate the ceremonies of old, the old Vedic soma ceremonies. I'm not sure what the purpose or point of that would be. I believe that the way forward is in listening to the plant and understanding what it wants, understanding the context and containers that it feels that it can help human beings to heal, to grow, to evolve, and live in respect, in communion, in communication. So I have shared the Phyllodeum purcellum with maybe a dozen people, and a few people I know have taken it more than a few times. It appears to be something that it takes the human body a few times to really make friends with it, to really lock in and understand it. At least for myself, the first 3 times were basically about the same amount of plant matter. And it was only the 3rd time when it really locked in and I began to have visionary effects. Though I have given it to some people who the first time they took it had extraordinary visual effects. One woman visiting an alien civilization and experiencing the civilization as if she was there. And I know this woman quite well. She doesn't normally experience anything quite so visionary and profound, even with ayahuasca. So, on the other hand, it may not be as hard-hitting. The effects might be quite subtle for some people, especially when they start to take it. And it reminds me in this way of peyote, which may hit some people very hard, but it may take some people some time to have a relationship with it, whereby they're going to really have this depth of communion and communication with the plant spirit. But what I can say is that it really is a profound and wise plant teacher that appears very masculine to most people, and yeah, I believe it can help a lot of people, and we're only really beginning to test and explore and see what it can do for the human species at this time. So this is the summation of my research of the 5-MeO DMT containing plants around the world. Comptonella drupacea has great therapeutic potential as a tea or sublingual preparation with potentially massive spiritual and physical benefits. This plant is less interesting as a source for extracted 5-MeO DMT as there is not much plant mass in the small bush. People are starting to grow this plant in Australia. Dictyoloma incanescens is perhaps the best candidate for extraction of a pure source of 5-MeO DMT. Limbs can be harvested from big trees and the bark taken, not harming the tree in any significant way. 5 kilograms of plant matter dried should yield 1 gram of 5-MeO DMT, which is 100 10 milligram smokes or 200 5 milligram smokes. Considering 1 gram of toad venom contains maybe 10 strong doses, this could be a very viable source of 5-MeO DMT. More research needs to be done on whether this plant can actually work well as an oral or sublingual preparation. The Varroa genus needs much more research, especially Sebifera, Theodora, and Elongata, as well as other species. Varroa is a much sought after wood, and much of it is being harvested for its wood. Varroa could be a good source for extracted 5-MeO, but which may take quite a bit of work to crack this code in potentially dangerous parts of the Amazon. Phylodium porcellum as a tea, even at 50 to 100 grams of fresh leaf matter, is as potent, if not more so, than ayahuasca or iboga. The healing and psychoactive effects are at once subtle and hard-hitting, profound and extraordinary. Because of the limited plant matter you get from one plant, it doesn't appear to be a good potential source of extracted 5-MeO DMT. Neither is it a pure source of 5-MeO DMT. Apparently people are already growing this plant in Australia, but I haven't heard of anyone extracting from it or making a tea from it. This plant very much appears to be the source botanical ingredient of the fabled Soma drink. So there we go. Thanks very much for listening.